and to look more closely at the developments to emerge from the ASEAN and East Asian summits. I'm joined by Geoff Garrett, the Dean of the University of Sydney Business School. Geoff Garrett, welcome to the program.
My pleasure, Whitney.
Now, what has been called the Asia pivot? How much of this is about the US stamping its presence on an area, a region where China has a dominance?
Well, I think the US would say China isn't dominant in Asia and that the US never left but is back. A bit of a contradiction there. What's really going on in US foreign policy, I think, is that Barack Obama has said that the future for the US, like the future for Australia, is going to be written largely in Asia, but the US is here. And then the China piece is interesting. Obama isn't trying to contain China. He's not hedging against China. What he's saying is, listen, there are what he's calling rules of the road. There are rules of the road that everybody should abide by. If China wants to play by those rules, we welcome you with open arms. But if you don't, we just want to remind you that we have lots of friends. And those rules of the road, of course, are both economic and in national security.
It's very early into his second term. Did you anticipate that he would make such a trip at this time?
The East Asia Summit is really important. It's the most important regional engagement for the US. Obviously, we noticed last year that Obama had a really big swing. He did APEC, then he was in Australia, then he did East Asia Summit. I'm not surprised he's here. The big business at home is the fiscal cliff, but that really is in Congress, and Obama has already signaled where he stands on that. So, no, this was the right thing to do. Although, of course, as I think will be the story for the next 4 years, when it comes to foreign policy crises for the US, they're still likely to be written mostly in the Middle East. So, yes, at a strategic level, the US wants to pivot to Asia. But foreign policy ends up being about crisis management, and the crises look like they're still going to come out of the Middle East.
But no doubt there's always been tensions between the US and China. So it reasserting itself in the region, what sort of tensions will that sort of lead to, renewed tensions or even further tensions?
Well, there's been an inhale-exhale there. I think after the global financial crisis, and in particular after China's spectacular withstanding of the crisis in 2009, many countries in the region thought that China got a little bit too aggressive. They wanted the US to re-engage. Obama's notion of a Pacific presidency was welcomed in the region. More recently, of course, we see it in Australia. People are saying, boy, the US is asking for things that really do look like they're aimed against China. I think what Obama and the US are trying to say is that's not true. Australia, Japan, Korea, Philippines all agree with the US, so the US says, on a lot of issues. And the US would then say, we don't want to isolate China, we just want you to play by our rules. The problem with that is that the core of Chinese foreign policy is, we won't tell you what to do, but please don't tell us what to do.
Well, that seems to have been a long point. So why is the US, I guess, sticking to that? Why can't they see that it's far more diplomatic to kind of have a macro view, I guess?
Well, I think their macro view is that China, over time, will actually find it in China's own interests to do the kinds of things that the US wants it to do. So I think it's a question of when,
economically
not if.
Speaking.
Well, economically, but probably in national security as well. I mean, we can break it down. But on the economic side, what the US really wants from China is market access, convertible currency, and more intellectual property protection. If China, for example, is to have a really powerful, globally connected financial sector, it's going to have to do all that stuff on its own. The Chinese leadership, of course, is cautious and tends to move slowly. The US might be wanting it to move a little more quickly, but I don't think that the US diplomacy should be considered in your face in any sense, because really the US is saying, we want to build these institutions and we want you to be part of them. And then there's a parenthesis, and the parenthesis is, oh, but you've got to do it on our terms, which, of course, in economic matters is exactly what happened when China joined the WTO. Bill Clinton encouraged that. China had to make some domestic changes to be in WTO, and I think 10 years after, everyone would say that was a big success.
All right. Out of these two significant meetings, there's been several trade sort of options that have come out. Speaking of the WTO, you only have to look at Doha to know that these types of large trade agreements are fraught with, sticking points and negotiations that can take some time. Mm-hmm. In your view, which deal is likely to have legs and actually get over the line, and what would be sticking points, I guess?
Okay, so big topic. The new arrangement that was announced yesterday is really an ASEAN-centred arrangement. ASEAN as a bloc has a lot of bilateral free trade agreements. So they're talking about tying a big bow around that. The alternative is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which has now been around for a few years, but really was turbocharged by Barack Obama. Australia's in both. Julia Gillard wanted to say she's interested in both. TPP is far more advanced than the ASEAN-centred grouping, the new one that was announced. But the challenge with TPP is it's aspirationally a much higher quality free trade agreement. Now, it's true that most of the current participants already have pretty extensive bilateral and high-quality deals between them. But I think the US wants TPP to expand. So, it doesn't have the big economies in Asia. It's got now Mexico and Canada as well as the US because of NAFTA. It's got Australia, but it doesn't have, for example, Japan and Korea. If those two economies were in, then we're talking a really significant arrangement and one that China would have to take very seriously, but that's going to be a difficult process. Obama said the deal would be done in 2012. Now he's bumped it off another year. I think
is this another Doha?
It's not Doha because I think the world has agreed implicitly, if not explicitly, that a multilateral global deal is undoable, and therefore these kind of mega regional trade deals are the best we can hope for. So it is the alternative to Doha in the most vibrant part of the global economy, but the barriers to completion are high. The only other thing I'd say about US leadership here is that it's always been the case that the US pursues free trade agreements at least as much for geopolitical reasons as for economic ones. And that's true in this case because the TPP signals the pivot, and it also creates this challenge for China.
Geoffrey Garrett, thank you for joining the program.
My pleasure.